and were kind of in for it collectively. Like Gandhi observes, he was asked once in the midst of trying to kick the British out by this guy who was what's known as a punkwalla, a person that was a laborer, and he just came up to Gandhi in this particular street fair and asked him, well, you know, what can I do? You know, I'm a real poor guy living on 2 rupees a year, that kind of thing. And Gandhi says, well, every person's individual action is absolutely insignificant, but vitally required, because it's our collective action that makes the difference.
Since we're over in India, you mentioned the chattering monkey mind, which is something that I remember from my yogic days. In what form do you use the chattering monkey mind? What does that mean to you?
Well, that actually refers to the internal dialogue, the linguistic center of the brain, in conjunction with its being triggered by consciousness and forming that internal dialogue that most people have, where your brain is basically a little monkey chattering at you, do this, do that, I want this, I want that, don't do this, I'm afraid of this, and so on and so on. If you do practice a discipline, and there's a great many, so we need not go into particulars, you can quell and conquer monkey mind, which to a certain extent also removes ego and opens you up to a greater experience of universe. Monkey mind is actually a nasty little thing, and it can be a good tool. It's what powers rationality, but it's one of those things where it's a very excellent slave and a terrible master.
And the monkey mind is where fear gets into the picture, is that
it articulates fear. Now, fear is an interesting thing. You have to understand that the human body is much more complex than we are given to understand in school. For instance, there's a whole neuron structure that's outside the brain. And where does it live? Well, this neuron structure that is the same kind of neurons you find in the brain, same chemical constituency and action and everything, is around the intestines. And so that's where fear actually lives, is within the abdomen. And it's triggered by that neural activity there, which is tied to the venous vagus nerve, which goes back up to the limbic system at the back of the brain. So, to a certain extent, monkey mind is merely the articulating aspect of that fear and the first real reaction of the fear. And we work in archetypes where we think body descriptors that show up in our work we take very seriously, because those are the lowest level of archetypes. So you always hear or read about, especially in horror movies or whatever, gut-wrenching fear. That's where you get it first. And if you notice, for instance, this is common to mammals of all kinds on the planet, where, for instance, a tiger is going to go out and get a zebra. Well, the zebra sees cheetah, whatever's chasing him, sees this animal coming after him, this predator. The first thing he does is dump his bowels, and it's an automatic response, because he can shed maybe 25 pounds of weight. Also, could put an impediment to the thing chasing him. However, it's a common reaction to mammals throughout the planet, and from there we started working about the various different archetypes. So, for instance, in our work, we have the higher archetypes of the love-based emotions centered in body functions that are higher than the abdomen. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. To me, it does.
Okay, so as we go along, we were looking at various different archetype words that indicated certain things, and we would say, oh, this is related to a fear reaction, even though we don't have a word fear, frightened, afraid, or any of that, because of the way they're describing things and some of the language coming out, we know that basically the context is in a fear-based mode around that particular subject.
Well, you think fear and survival, and so I would imagine that anything that has to do with the survival of the person is going to generate the fear. Is that what you were looking at?
That's basically what we were looking at, because if you notice, way back in 96 or whatever, I noticed that a lot of the reactions on the stock market were driven by the irrational exuberance, right, which is more of a hyped anti-fear, but it's still fear-based, or it was by the absolute fear that something would go wrong. And so you would get these wave reactions, oh, buy this, buy this, buy this, on the irrational exuberance component, but you would also find wave reactions of sell, 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 I'm afraid it's going to go down, thus the 1987 compounding problems, and so on. So when we were dealing with it as strictly a potential moneymaker, we started delineating the emotions these various different ways.
And you can hear the music. We've got to take a break. I am talking with Clif High from #human, and I can imagine that all of you are hanging on the edge of your seats just like I am. One of the things that I want to ask you when we get back is you mentioned a backlash against the powers that be. And so let's start there when we get back.
Okay.
You're listening to Rumor Mill News Radio on the Micro Effect Radio Broadcast Network. You're listening to Rumor Mill News Radio. We're talking to Clif from #human, and before we went to break, I said to Clif that in his Veritas interview, and the reason I keep referring to the Veritas interview is Clif is not an easy person to find out things about. And so instead of going over the Internet and reading things about him, you have to go to radio shows and listen to Clif himself tell who he is, which is a pretty neat thing, in my opinion, Clif.
Well, I kind of like it myself, yeah.
Yeah, because that way it's in your own words and people don't misquote you.
Well, then there's the other aspect of that, too. In the nature of our work, we're actually scrubbing the Internet, and we have to watch out that we don't stumble over our own stuff. Because then it gets us into the circuitous reference stuff when we start picking up our own data, and it balloons our own processing. We ran into this immediately after the 9/11 incident, because we'd had the data out there since June or July 12th or something, and so we passed 90 days or whatever. Around probably the 28th or 29th of that September, I did another data run and ran into my own stuff everywhere and had to stop for, 30 days and write a bunch of filters to scrub it out. So it was after that, never again. So I knew that in order to keep the process running, I had to have some level of control over the propagation of it.
That makes absolute perfect sense to me. Now I understand. But in this Veritas interview, you said that you see a backlash against the powers that be. And you sort of were mentioning the flu and that the media, that people were not going to believe the media. What form or what in your analysis makes you think that, and what form do you think it might manifest in?
Okay, we have to have two separate slight discussions there. The first is what in our data shows up, and then the second is what does my particular monkey mind apply an interpretation as to how this event is likely to manifest. And the data is usually fairly accurate, but as I tell my associate here, George, all the time, if we can visualize it, that's probably not how it's going to show up. It'll be different because universe likes surprise. But basically, we have a lot of data indicating that one of the three control arms of the powers that be is going to fade out by, let's say, the 21st of September of this year. And by fade out, I mean it will have visibly less effect on the control of the population. Now, right at the moment, we're presuming that that's going to be the media because we, in our monkey minds, think that the media is the weakest of the three control arms, the control arms being military, and then economic/legal, and then the third is the propaganda arm, which is the media. And it's our presumption that the media is the weakest and will fail. Need not actually manifest that way, but at the moment that's what we're figuring because there's all of this other data at a detail level suggesting that the media is in for some, and by that I mean what we think of as the mainstream media, broadcast news, these kind of guys, not independent media. Non-corporate entities are not included in this, but the large mega corporations owned by the 5 individuals that control most of the media on the planet are, and we think that they're going to really suffer a huge setback in a number of different areas that will get to the point where there will be manifestations in the sense of, there might be a demonstration somewhere about everybody irritated because of the continuing economic collapse, and a media van shows up, and we'll see things like the $200,000 truck being turned over, and it'll curiously be shot by non-media individuals, and we'll see this sort of thing on YouTube. Eventually, YouTube's going to run into some real issues.
What do you see for YouTube?
Well, late in the year, and I don't know at what point, but probably beyond the autumnal equinox, we see a situation where the powers that be have to, or they start reacting to citizens of the planet, journalists, who are recording all their evil deeds and getting a great deal of play on it, because, as I say, we think the mainstream media will start to collapse a lot. As it collapses, we can envision a huge shift in attention over to other alternative media sources such as YouTube. And so it all sort of hangs together.
You know, it's really interesting because a few days ago I wrote an article that we can't even be citizens anymore, that Homeland Security has outlawed alternative press, it's outlawed, anything that's right-wing, anything that's Republican, and then it's got all of these citizen sovereign movements, citizen reporter, citizen this, citizen that. We can't even be citizens anymore.
Sure, I understand that. And as a sovereign individual, I dispute the necessity for the geographic arrangements that we have now, the political arrangements. In other words, I'm a citizen of the planet Earth. The fact that some authority decides that up there is Canada and down here is the U.S. is outside of, or is beyond my ability to deal with at the moment, but nonetheless, I don't have to recognize nor support that.
I agree with you, and I think a whole bunch of other people worldwide. The Internet has done one thing for us all. It's made us realize that we are family first.
Correct.
That we are the human family first.
And that actually is part of the collapse issue, is the emergence of the holonomy over summer. There's a giant paradigm shift underway
I think
now.
this is wonderful. Let's get back into it after we come back from this break. You are listening to Rumor Mill News Radio. I am talking with Clif High from Half Past Human, and we will be right back here on the Micro Effect Broadcast Network. You're listening to Rumor Mill News Radio on the Micro Effect Broadcast Network. I'm talking with Clif High from Half Past Human. And before we went to break, we were talking about a worldwide paradigm shift. Now, is this part of your WebBot predictions? And if so,
this
what came up that allowed you to interpret it this way?
Well, we noticed over time that emotional values collected on very emotionally active words would tend to cluster around certain context and persist over time and, in fact, grow. And so we started to, and then we also noticed in the course of analysis that some of these contexts would be duplicated in other areas of our model space, almost in a, say, 60 to 80% copy. And so I started aligning these things all together and sort of what we call flopping the data, which is looking at taking the rows and columns and reversing them so that your columns become rows and vice versa, and then looking at the data in a different way. We started noticing, in general, that these key words were clustering around even greater concepts, and it went on and on up, and we could track it up to what we called metadata layers. So at the moment, we have a series of these that are not quite ubiquitous throughout the model space, but really growing, that cover, say, about 40% of our key entities. And one of the metadata layers is what has been titled undeniability, because it's built around the context of deniability, only it's being negated by the data. And so our paradigm shift is arising from a number of different areas across the model space in terms of our forecast around the idea that various forms of active denial will no longer work once we get through this particular summer. And by active denial, I mean the people that are out there running around saying happy days are just around the corner, prosperity is only, 2 clicks